Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Alice Will, Dreams of Chaos, Book 1 by Ashley Chappell, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. Religion is a byproduct of living in a world brimming with gods, and a byproduct of religion, though it's really more of an occupational hazard, is the apocalypse. Following this formula, each of the many religions of the flat world of Avum spawned their own expectations for the end of the world, but given that the end of the world was also the end of the believers, no one was still around to say, "I told you so," when the end actually came. The only religion that came close to what really happened was the Nihili's belief that one day the world would simply fall out of reality and ultimately never have existed in the first place. Not one of them ever suspected that the world would end by being swallowed by the imagination of a child. See that child here, a frail thing, hurting, sad, and alone, making her way through a blizzard with barely a drop of moonlight piercing the snow. This snow is the kind that gangs up on the way down and forms snowballs filled with ice shrapnel. Now see her here, crawling quickly under the boughs of Grandfather Tree, the giant fir that had been by the river longer than even the village. Digging beneath the needles with frozen fingers, then finding the tattered book she so loved. The shadow of the word journal is across the front cover of the book, barely visible as the gold leafing had long ago peeled away. Squinting in the muted light filtering through the snow-encased limbs, she rereads her last entry before creating a new one. The entry was happy, it was beautiful, and it sounded like it had been a perfect day for any 6-year-old girl. It was just a shame that it had been nothing like her real day. It never was. Chapter 1. What? What the? Oh, gross! Trotter went from deeply asleep and dreaming to awake and revolted in under 2 seconds. Waking up to a cat's paw shoved against your lips will usually have that effect. "Prowler, that's disgusting," she said as she tried to wipe her mouth with her sleeve, even though it probably wasn't much cleaner. "What's wrong with you?" The cat, a sleek gray-blue creature, narrowed his eyes at her and pretended to suddenly find her less interesting than the bit of trash in his paw. "Seriously, why would you even do that? Other cats gently nuzzle their people awake, you know. And I know you've been out all day, so gods only know where that paw's been." She tried to spit. Prowler sniffed and turned his back to her. It's well established that cats demand gratitude for every gesture they make toward their owner, from dragging in fresh kills to considerately covering their poo in the cat box. If this gratitude is not tendered, then you simply cease to exist as a part of the world which interests them. Trotter left her bed with a stretch, and Prowler connived to keep his back to her as she crossed the room while she's still trying to pretend that he hadn't noticed her existence. It was the same effect you get from the pictures with eyes that seem to follow you everywhere you go, only in reverse. She patted the pouting cat on the head as she walked behind him and was hissed at before he returned to the careful study of his paw. "So I guess this isn't the part where you're going to apologize for waking me up with whatever new disease you walked through? Just thought I'd check," she added when he glared back in response. She shoved the makeshift curtain aside, and the purples, pinks, and reds of another amazing sunset over the picturesque harbor of Serrano poured into the room. "Crap! It's almost sunset already. I'll miss the market." "Oh, now she gets it." Prowler wheeled around and faced her with a harassed air. "I simply try to wake her up before she's late, and I get nothing but grief for it." Cats are natural masters of the haughty stare, but Prowler had the advantage of having had much longer than the average cat to take the art from mere mastery to sheer perfection. About 180 years longer, in fact. "Is that what this is about?" Trotter sighed. He was temperamental, but Prowler was still the best friend she had. "I'm sorry. Thank you, Prowler, for waking me up in time for the market, but don't you think there might be better ways of waking me up next time? Maybe like telling me to wake up rather than sticking your paw in my mouth?" He twitched his tail. "I tried. But you couldn't hear me over the racket you were making, and considering that you've been snoring for the past 2 hours, you're lucky I waited until now to put my paw in your mouth. Actually, as loud as you were, you're lucky it was just my paw." "I don't snore," Trotter mumbled. Prowler leapt up into the windowsill beside her and continued, effectively accepting her apology while by no means acknowledging it. "Anyway, I ran into Miro earlier this afternoon. She said she'd have everything on your list ready when you got there tonight." Not surprising, even though Trotter hadn't even given Miro her list yet. Miro always knew everything. No matter what you asked her, she always had it, and usually included what you were going to ask her for before you even asked. It was a little unnerving sometimes. She slid the first clothes she found on the floor over her sleeping gown and reached for her brush, closing her hand on empty air. It was usually on the crates she'd stacked up under the mirror, but it wasn't there now. A glance around the warehouse loft found plenty of junk from wood scraps to iron chunks to broken tools, but no hairbrush. Prowler, have you seen my brush anywhere? It wouldn't be brown with a tortoiseshell handle by any chance, would it? He asked with contrived innocence. You know it would be. It's the only brush I have. Now why don't you tell me where it is? When he didn't answer straight away, her eyes searched lower to the ground. Sure enough, there it was, a few inches above the floor, adhered to the wall on a sticky wad of gloop. It was filled suspiciously with blue-gray hairs. Are you kidding me? How did you even do that without thumbs? Thumbs? He laughed contemptibly. The day I miss having thumbs is the day I quit living this feline existence. Claws are so much more utilitarian. Besides, if you brushed me more often, I wouldn't have to resort to such drastic measures. Thumbs. Who needs thumbs anyway? He muttered to himself before returning to the licking of his paw. Trotter gave him an apprising look and glanced from the wall back to him. You glued your paw to the wall, didn't you? That's why you've been licking it so much. That's ridiculous, he sneered defiantly. She continued to look sternly at him and waited patiently while his defiant sneer melted into a dejected sulk. Okay, he conceded, but it was only for a minute. I'd like to see you do as well given the circumstances. Besides, it's not like you need a brush. You make your hair to do what you want it to do. It never works out like I picture it, she said, a whine creeping into her voice. It was true, though. No matter what glamorous style she imagined for her hair to weave itself into, she always ended up looking like she'd been attacked by a failed beautician turned circus costumer. What do you expect? You're only 14. Most demigods spend years practicing to get the hang of their powers, and you refuse to try half the time. These things take practice and patience. No better time than now, as they say. All right, fine. She started to concentrate and realized she was still being watched. I can't do it with you looking. Prowler rolled his eyes and turned his back to her. It was so embarrassing to be watched, especially when you weren't even very good at magic to begin with. She focused and pictured her hair growing longer and sleeker, the mousy brown turning itself into a luxurious chestnut brown, and piling itself on top of her head in the elaborate fashion of the day. She opened her eyes and looked at Prowler. Well? She asked hesitantly. Cat expressions are usually hard to read, but this one was clearly full of shock. Oh my, do you still have that hat perhaps? You know, the really, really big one? She glanced at the mirror across from her and for just a moment thought a large fruit was looking back at her. I'm never going to get the hang of this, am I? Some demigod I am. She dropped onto the floor under the window and laid her head against the wall in defeat, her head coming to rest on the unnaturally cloud-like pillow of hair. Prowler dropped down next to her without a sound. Cheer up, he said as he laid his head down on her lap. It's not really that bad. It's a bit too big and fluffy, but I'm sure no one will notice how orange it is. They may even think you're trying to start a trend. You'd be amazed at the types of things that catch on. Right. I'm sure someone out there is just dying for an excuse to try a hairdo that looks like a giant pumpkin. The sounds of the seaport city of Serrano winding down this day filtered up to her window above the old doorknob factory. She could hear the rattling of the trundlers' carriages and their snorting old mares as the trundlers freshened the oil and lit each of the street lamps. When they finished, the street would be almost as bright as day, and those who worked the night shift would take over the twilight city. Seaport cities never truly slept, not when there was money to be made every hour of the day. She gave up on restyling her hair. It had a stubborn mind of its own, so she'd be stuck with this until she woke up tomorrow. All right, I guess we should get going. She gently picked Prowler up and set him on the floor beside her as she stood up, trying to smooth down her hair. He stretched and yawned dramatically. I was counting on a nap. I've been out all day long. I thought cats were practically nocturnal. I'm sure alley cats and other such ragged beasts are, but I like to keep to higher standards. Well, you don't have to go, but I heard that Aggie Mim is fixing her cheddar rat souffle for the night market tonight. But if you're not interested, she trailed off, suggesting a possible future without the coveted souffle. Dear, dear Aggie. His voice would have been silken to the touch. The wench could do black magic in the kitchen with a nice plump rat. If only she were a cat, he said wistfully. He turned and headed toward the door, looking back to see if Trotter was behind him. Aren't we leaving now? Don't forget your hat, he added with a fang-filled grin. Trotter grimaced. Even if I actually had a sense of humor, that still wouldn't have been funny. She made one last attempt at forcing the cloud of hair back down before trying to tuck it unsuccessfully into a scarf. It wasn't much of an improvement. It now looked less like a pumpkin and more like a turban. She took one last look in the mirror and sighed. Oh well, at least Mira will have my shopping list already, so maybe no one will even see me. One can only hope. Now let's go. I mustn't keep Aggie waiting. The door to the inn opened and shut quickly. In weather like this, it was practically a hanging offense to leave it open for long. Despite the haste with which it had been closed, the wind still seized the opportunity to deliver a blow to the raging fire in the hearth before being cast back outside. The flames and swirling ash resettled quickly and began anew the tedious work of spreading their heat back across the sitting room. But the cold gripped each body with icicle teeth while the fire fought to exorcise it. The guests of the Tarbach Inn clutched at their cloaks, waiting for the cold to abate before returning to their beers and hot ciders. This storm was what they referred to as a tartar snow, meaning that you could see just as well outside if you smeared mayonnaise on your eyeballs. There were always guests at the inn in the winter. Some were delayed here all winter long if they didn't make the pass to the south before the snows walled them in. They were usually merchants or travelers seeking the famous lights of the northern sky, but the inn saw its fair share of soldiers and mercenaries as well. At some point in Drimp's long history, the nobles discovered that the best way to keep the peasants from freezing to death was to keep them active, and the easiest way to keep them active, they'd also discovered, was fighting. The fighting, in turn, also provided the added benefit of thinning down the numbers a bit so there would never be too great a shortage of food. Drimpt had then divided itself into baronies, which warred with each other almost constantly. The village of Klimt, which was famed for the hospitality of the Tarbach Inn, found itself in the barony of Prostich. The inn was not luxurious by any usual definition. However, it was always clean and full of food and warmth, both of which were luxuries in many households in Trimpt. The Trimish were not an altogether talkative people, but the conversation at the inn this morning was scarce, even by their standards. The quiet seemed awkward and forced, particularly near the lone man warming himself by the parlor fire. The other guests, casting furtive glances toward him when they dared, were crowding at the bar near the kitchen hearth where Frida, the innkeeper's wife, was boiling a spicy stew of sausages, onion, and barley flour. Earl, one of the guests quietly addressed the innkeeper, do you have any more of the rum for the cider? Alice will get that for you, Mr. Porter. Alice? Frida turned from her stew pot and called for their servant. A little girl of 6 entered from upstairs where she had been dressing the beds. Alice, get Mr. Porter some more rum, will you? Alice disappeared and reappeared with a quickness known only to children with a heavy clay jar of rum. It took both of her hands to carry it. Frida flashed the girl an irritated look and took the jar from her hands to pour for Mr. Porter. I told him not to get one so young, she confided quietly to Mr. Porter. I told him we'd spend all our time as nursemaids before she'd ever be any use to us. Well, you know how it is. You take what you can get at a decent price from the auction. Due to the ever-present wars in Drimpt, there was never a food shortage, but there was also never a shortage of new widows and orphans either. To solve the problem of guardianship for those unable to care for themselves, the baronies had instituted the auctions. Widows and orphans were then auctioned off as indentured servants until such time as they were able to marry, remarry, or otherwise provide for themselves. Still, Mr. Porter continued, she seems to put her heart into whatever she does. I've had some as couldn't even stack a pile of wood myself. He looked warmly into the face of Alice. She was a tiny thing for even for her young age, with locks of curling blonde hair and eyes the green of emeralds. She was filthy, but there was something beneath the grime that transfixed the observer. Don't let her fool you. As soon as she thinks we aren't looking, she'll sneak off again to the river and hide there all night. But the girl doesn't even have any shoes on. It doesn't stop her. It's as if she doesn't feel it, Frida whispered conspiratorially. Mr. Porter looked away from the small girl's smile, feeling suddenly uncomfortable. The commonest way to keep a servant from running away was to ensure that they had no shoes in which to run. Alice, per tradition, had been provided with a small pair of leather thongs to protect her feet as minimally as possible. Feet that spent long unprotected in the snows around the village should have been lost. Frida, where are the plastic beer mugs? Earl was searching under the counter of the bar. Alice will get them. She turned an angry eye on Alice, who ran to the kitchen. Beside the wash basin were a dozen ceramic beer mugs, clean and dry. She began to gather them when, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted several strips of salted pork on the cutting board. Alice! Frida called from the front. Her patience was always fragile, but it came closer to terminal whenever the child was concerned. Alice carried as many of the mugs as in her arms as she could carry to Earl and kept her head down as she handed them to him. She ran back into the kitchen and returned with another armload a minute later. After Earl took the last one from her, she ducked under the bar and behind the cabinets where her bed of thin blankets and pillows was kept out of sight from the guests. When she sat down, she pulled the salted pork she'd hidden under her dress and chewed on it slowly, savoring the juices. She was so hungry.